Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Pei Ches contains one Mishnah and a number of different sugyas. The Daf begins. We begin a few lines into the Daf discussing two Agadata Gemaras about the day of Geula, our final redemption. The Gemara then refers back to our Mishnah and discusses which dependents he may include in his carbon Pesach and which ones have a right to choose for themselves where they would like to belong. The Gemara then discusses somebody who is half an Eved and half free, or an Eved which belongs to two different owners, how he works as far as carbon Pesach is concerned. And then we'll get to then we'll have the next Mishnah, which discusses the subject of somebody bringing a carbon for somebody else as his messenger, but there's confusion as to whether he wants to bring a sheep or a goat, and how you can resolve that situation. So first of all, we have two Agadatas about Geula. So the Gemara first of all says as follows: the pasuk says, the nations of the world will say, let's go up to the base, to the house of Elokei Yaakov, the God of Yaakov. So the Gemara says, why Yaakov? What about Avraham Yitzchak? So the Gemara says, well, Yaakov was the one who called it a bayis. He called Yerushalayim a house, a settled, lived-in area. Avram called it a har, like it says Bahar Hashem Yireh. Yitzchak called it a field, like it says Yitzchak L'Suach Bosada. However, Yaakov called it a house, like it says V'yikra Hashem Hamachemahu Beis Kel, and the nations will be referring to it as an inhabited place, and that's why it's going to be called Beis Elokei Yaakov. Next, the Gemara says the day of the Geula will be as great as the day of creation of the heaven and the earth, and all of creation really. Like the pasuk says, the two psukim, one describing each, both use the word Yom. Describing the Geula, the pasuk says Vayikra Hashem HaMakom. Describing the Geula, the pasuk says V'nikvetzu b'nei Yehuda b'nei Yisrael yachdav v'samu lahem roish echad v'ol min haaretz ki gadol Yom Yisrael. And about creation, about the world, it says Vayer v'hibayker Yom echad. Okay, the Gemara now goes back to the Mishnah and refers to the subject of whether one is allowed to include in his carbon Pesach people who are dependent upon him against their will or without their agreement. And the Gemara is going to generally say the following rule: if it's someone who's dependent on him for his food, he cannot refuse and make his own carbon Pesach, then the master or the boss, whoever it is, doesn't have to ask his permission to include him, and he doesn't even have to agree. He can do it for him against his will. If it is somebody, however, who's independent and he can choose to do his own, then you can't do one for him without his agreement or without his will. Tomorrow we'll discuss what happens if it's a stam, that is somebody who hasn't given his agreement or his displeasure. What can you do about that case? So first of all, we begin by referring to the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says that somebody's an orphan who has two guardians, and they each do a carbon Pesach for him. He can choose whichever one he wants to join. So Gemara says, so that means yesh beira. That means that we're saying that we will say that the one he chooses later is really the one that he wanted at the time of Shechita, and that's why he's included in that one. So Gemara says, no, that's not the pshat. The pshat is not that he's deciding later and he's revealing which one he really wanted in the beginning. The pshat is that we don't need his permission necessarily. Then both guardians have the right to make a carbon Pesach for him, and therefore he's included in both, and he can choose whichever one he wants. And this is because there's a pasuk that says Sel Beisavai Sel Abayis, that shows that the family that you're a part of has an automatic right to include you in their carbon. Now on the subject, the Gemara quotes a brisa. The brisa says if somebody has children, so his minor children, boys under age 13 and girls under age 12, he can include them in his carbon against their will, because they can't make their own carbon, they don't have their own money, they can't buy their own sheep, they can't make their own. Somebody's Eved Kenani, that applies to as well, he doesn't have his own funds. However, an Eved Ivri who does have his own money, or a child who is adult, he cannot include against his will. He can only include them if they will and if they agree. Now, his wife also falls into that category. He can also do a carbon for her if she agrees. Gemara brings two brises which spell all this out, and the second brisa adds a halacha. The second brisa says that anybody from this group who has their father or husband or master, whoever it is, make a carbon for them, and they also make their own carbon, which carbon do they belong to? The masters, the fathers, except for the wife. The wife belongs to her own carbon. So Gemara asks, why should the wife be different than anyone else? The wife has the right to make her own. She has a right to reject her husband's. But an adult child and an Eved Ivri also have a right to reject their masters and their fathers. So you should also have a right, and we should also therefore say that if the master or the father made a carbon and they made one themselves, they belong to their own carbon. So the Gemara says, yes, you're right, that is the halacha. When we said that a woman is different, we meant a woman and anyone who's in the same category as a woman, which includes adult children and Eved Ivri. So again, the halacha therefore comes out that anybody who could refuse the carbon, if they do make their own carbon, that counts as a refusal, and therefore they belong to their own carbon and not to the carbon that was made for them. Now the Gemara asks, what happens if nobody specifies? We had said before that they have to refuse. We had said that if they refuse, then they're not included. On the other hand, when it says that the master, the owner, the father could make a carbon for them, it only says midaiton, with their intent, with their knowledge. So that seems to be contradictory. The Gemara says, no, the truth is, if they don't see anything, it's assumed that they want it. And when we said that it's midaiton, that it's with their knowledge, that means that they didn't specifically reject it. As far as the case of the woman who made her own carbon, or anybody else who could, and we say that they go with their own carbon. And now with the husbands, even though they didn't specifically reject it, the making of the carbon itself is an innate rejection of the carbon that was made for them. Okay, the Gemara now discusses an Eved, which belongs to two masters. And the Gemara says that our Mishnah seems to be contradicting a Brisa. Our Mishnah said that he can't eat from either master's carbon, and I have a Brisa that says he can eat from both, so which is it? So the Gemara says the question was asked to Ravina Saba, and he answered that it depends on the relationship between the masters. If the masters don't get along with each other, and they wouldn't want their half Eved to eat from the other person's carbon, so then he can't eat from either. If the masters do get along with each other, and they're very happy for their half Eved to eat from the other person's carbon, then there's no problem at all. Next thing we saw in the Mishnah was that somebody who's half Eved and half free, that means he belongs half to himself and half to a master, so he's allowed to eat from his master's carbon. The assumption is that his free half is happy eating from his master's half. The question is, can he eat from his own carbon? Is the master half allowed to eat from his? So the Gemara says that the implication in our Mishnah is that he cannot, but we have a different Brisa that says that he can. Contradiction. Where it says no, there is a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and Beis Hillel changed to hold like Beis Shammai, and therefore one Mishnah is before Beis Hillel changed, and the Brisa is after Beis Hillel changed. What's the machlokes about? Machlokes is about what do we do with somebody who's half an Eved and half free. So the Gemara said that Beis Hillel's initial opinion was that we say that he serves himself one day and serves his master one day, switch off who he works for, and that way everybody gets their fair share. The Gemara says that Beis Shammai said that's fair for the master because he gets all the work he needs, but it's not fair for the Eved because he can't marry anybody. He can't marry a shivcha because he himself is half free, and a free man's not allowed to marry a shivcha. He can't marry a bas chorin, a free woman, because of his half Eved half. So what is he supposed to do? So therefore we force his master to free him, sell him his other half, then he goes free. We can't say he should stay unmarried because the pasuk says you gotta be able to procreate. So therefore, Beis Shammai wanted to hold that we force him to free. Beis Hillel then changed and agreed that we do force the master to free him. Now, once we force the master to free him, therefore the free half has rights in his Eved half as well, because he can force it to be freed. That being the case, the free half is allowed to, the entire person is allowed to eat from the carbon of the free half, because we can free the Eved half, and therefore the Eved half is allowed to eat from the free half. When Beis Shammai, before they changed and held their own opinion, they said that he's not allowed to eat from his own carbon because his Eved half is not allowed to eat from something that belongs to his free half. But now we get the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens when somebody sends his Eved to bring a carbon Pesach for him, but there's confusion as to whether he wanted him to bring a goat or a sheep. There's a couple things to keep in mind here. Somebody has to be signed up for a specific carbon, and only for one carbon. You cannot be signed up to two carbonos, and the carbon that you choose has to be the right one. If it's the wrong one, you're not signed up to it, you can't eat from it. And if a carbon has nobody who can eat from it, the carbon itself has a soul, it's got to be eaten. So how do we take care of this situation? So the Mishnah discusses three cases. The first case is where the master says to the Eved, go shech the carbon Pesach for him, and he didn't specify whether it should be a goat or a sheep. So the Eved has the right to choose whichever one he wants, and whichever one he chooses, that's the one he should do, and that's the one that the owner is assumed to have signed up for, even if he generally signs up for the other one. Whichever one he did, that's the one that counts because he didn't give a specific instruction. Now, what happens if he brings both a goat and a sheep, because he wants to do both because he doesn't know which one the master wants? So then whichever one he does first is the one that the master is signed up for and he should eat, and the other one is not used, that it goes to the garbage. Now, what happens though if the master did specify, but the Eved doesn't remember what he said? Now you can't just bring whatever you want because the master specifically said one, and you got to be the right one, and you can't just bring them both and throw one out. So, because he has to be signed up to the one that is his. So what are you supposed to do? So the Gemara says the Eved brings 2 karbanos, a goat and a sheep, and he says it tonight. He says, if my master wanted a goat, then the goat's his and the sheep's mine. If he wanted a sheep, then the sheep's his and the goat's mine. And then when he brings it back, the master says whichever one he wanted, and then the other one he can take for himself. Now what happens if he goes back and the master himself forgot? Now, nobody knows. Now you have a real problem. Nobody can eat from anything because we don't know which is which, and you can't eat a carbon they weren't signed up for. So they can't eat anything. However, the Mishnah says they don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni because they brought a kosher carbon. They just don't know which one it is, and they can't eat it. But they did bring a kosher carbon, and they're really Mina Shemayim. Shemayim understands which one is which, and they're allowed to eat it. They just practically can't get to either of them. Okay, says the Gemara, let's see if I understand this here. I understand that it's simple that if he shachted a goat or a sheep for the master, or back in the first case where the master didn't specify, whichever one he did for him, that's the one that he signed him up to. He didn't specify, so I can sign him up to whichever one I want. However, if the Eved brought both, we said he could eat the first one, but why should that be? That means the Eved was signing up to 2 karbanos, and you can't sign up to 2 karbanos, therefore he shouldn't have either. I mean, the implication from the Mishnah is that he signed up to both and he should take the first one, but you can't be signed up to both. So Gemara says we're not saying he was signed up to both. We're talking about a case where it was a king and a queen, and a king and a queen are so used to eating all these fancy foods, they don't care if they're signed up to a sheep or a goat. Therefore, they don't really care. The reason why they should take the first one is because whichever one the Eved did first is good, because they don't care which one. And therefore they're signed up to only the first one. The second one they're not signed up to at all, and that one can get it thrown out. The Gemara brings a brisa to support this. Brisa says there was a case that happened with a king and a queen that they told their servants to go and bring a carbon in Pesach. They didn't specify, and they went and they brought 2 carbon in Pesach and didn't know what to do. So they went and asked the king, what should we do? So the king said, I don't know, ask the queen. The queen's smarter than me. The queen didn't know either, so she said, go ask Rabbi Gamliel. And Rabbi Gamliel said, kings and queens don't care what they eat, and therefore they're allowed to eat from the first one, throw out the other one. But he said, but if it would be the rest of us, we do care, we wouldn't be allowed to eat either of them, because we only are allowed to be signed up to one, and this Eved went and signed us up to both. Now, the Gemara brings another story with a king and a queen, probably the same king and queen. The Gemara says they found a lizard in one of the pots in the kitchen by a major Suda, and the lizard was dead, and they wanted to be metame the entire Suda. A lizard is one of the Shemaina Shrotzim, the 8 rodents that causes tumult. So they went and asked the king, what should we do? He said, I don't know, ask the queen. Queen said, I don't know, ask Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel said, was it a hot pot, a cold pot? They said hot. He said, pour cold water on him, see what happens. They did, and lo and behold, he started squirming around because he was really alive. There are comments that you see that the king is dependent on the queen is dependent on Rabbi Gamliel, and the entire Suda is dependent on Rabbi Gamliel. Okay, back in the Mishnah we had seen that if the master specified and we didn't know which one, so the Eved should bring 2, and with a Tanai, whichever one the master wanted is his, and the other one's mine. The Gemara says the other one's yours. You're an Eved doesn't own money. How could he possibly have anything belong to him? They end up both being the masters, and therefore you have 2 korbanos sign up to the master, and it's a problem. Versus what he should do is he should go to a shepherd who has a relationship with the master, and the shepherd therefore wants to take care of the master, and say to him, I need to buy 2 sheep from you, sell me one that should be the master's, and sell me one on the condition that it belongs to me and not the master's. In a situation like that, when somebody does that, it does belong to the Eved and not to the master, and then he has 2 sheep, one to the Eved, one to the master. He has 2 animals, one to the Eved, one to the master, and he could say whichever one the master wanted is the one that's just his, and the other one is going to be mine. Okay, referring back to the Mishnah, we've seen the halacha that if the master and the Eved both forgot which carbon the master specified, neither of them can eat any carbon, and they have to throw them both out. but they are yotzi the carbon Pesach. They don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni. The reason for that is that the master signed up to one, the Eved signed up to the other. We just don't know which is which, so they can't eat it because they might be eating from a carbon that they're not signed up to, which is forbidden. However, they're yaitza because in Shemayim they do have a kosher carbon which is theirs, and it's not a problem. Says the Gemara. A quote of Abaye. The Gemara then says that quote may actually be referring to a different case, and then the Gemara will compare which of the cases is more likely, and then the Gemara will try to figure out why the halacha is true. So first of all, Abaye's halacha is as follows. Abaye says that this halacha, which we said that that neither of them have to bring a Pesach Sheni because they are yaitza with the carbon, is only true if at the time that the avoda was finished, that the blood was thrown on the mizbeach, they knew which one was which. The master at the time knew which one he said. If, however, they had forgotten already at that time, that means at the time that the avoda was being done, they couldn't eat it. That's absul. This is a carbon which nobody could eat while the avoda is being performed. That's a puzzle carbon, and therefore it's useless. Now, the Gemara says that some have this halacha of Abaye in a different case, and that's a case where 5 people brought a carbon Pesach, and they took the skins, they mixed them up, they don't know which skin is which, and then they found a mum on one of them. So somebody brought a puzzle carbon because it has a mum, and the other 5 have a kosher carbon. Now, nobody could eat from the carbon Pesach because he might not be, because his might be a Baal Mum, but nobody has to bring a Pesach Sheni because his might be the kosher one. So the Gemara says that Abaye's statement would apply to this. That's only if this situation developed after the zrika of the blood was performed on the mizbeach, that was performed b'kashros, at a time when you could eat it. If, however, at the time that the zrika was done, you already knew about the mum, and therefore you couldn't eat your carbon, it's a situation where you have a carbon that can't be eaten during the time of the avoda, and that's a psul, and therefore nobody's yaitza, and everybody has to bring a Pesach Sheni. Says the Gemara, the one who says this halacha of Abaye is going on the Mishnah would certainly say it on the Brisa. If Abaye says on the Mishnah, where both carbon Pesachs are good, you just don't know which one it is, that if that situation existed at the time of Zrika, it's a psul and he can't bring a carbon, he would certainly say it on the case of the Brisa, where one of them really is puzzle, you just don't know which one it is. If, however, Abaye said it on the case of the skins, where one of them is really puzzle, and one person here is not yaitza, you just don't know which one it is. If Abaye said there that if that situation existed at the time of Zrika, it's a psul, and everybody has to bring a new carbon, he would not necessarily say so on the case of our Mishnah, where both karbanos are kosher for sure, you just don't know which one it is. Now the Gemara says, let's understand, in this case of the 5 karbanos where one has a mum, why can't you bring a Pesach Sheni? Why are they putter from bringing a Pesach Sheni? 4 of them are yaitza, but one of them is not yaitza. One of them brought a puzzle carbon with a mum. So Gemara said that the reason is not that he was yaitza, the reason is that 5th guy, there's no solution for him. There is no mutter way for him to bring a carbon Pesach Sheni, because what should we do? We don't know who he is. So what should we do? We should have all 5 people bring a carbon Pesach Sheni. That means 5 people are bringing a carbon that they're not chayvin. They're bringing a chulin to the azara. They're shachting a carbon which is wrong. Bringing a Pesach Sheni that they're not chayvin. The Gemara suggests another solution. Maybe we should have all 5 of them sign up to one carbon. That way they each are part of a carbon Pesach, and you don't have a problem of one being brought which is not kosher, which is not a chiv. So Gemara says that's no good, because then one of them, because 4 of them don't belong to this carbon, they already had a carbon. If they're going to eat it, then you have a carbon Pesach being eaten by people who aren't signed up to it. So Gemara says, okay, let's do like this. Each one bring their own carbon and make it tanai. If I'm chayiv, if I was the one with the bum moment, I'm chayiv in a carbon Pesach, so then this is a carbon Pesach. If, however, I'm not chayiv, so this is a regular shlamim, and there's no problem. Gemara says the problem with that is what are you going to do with the chaz of a shaykh? The parts of a carbon shlamim that have to be eaten by a kohen. You're going to give it to a kohen to eat or not? If the kohen, if it's really a shlamim, the kohen's supposed to eat it. But if it's a carbon Pesach, then the kohen's eating from a carbon that he's not signed up to. Has a right to eat it. So Gemara says, so let each one bring a kohen and sign him up to his carbon. Gemara says, what kind of a kohen? If it's a kohen that is chayiv in carbon Pesach Sheni, so then what's he going to do if this is really a shlamim? He's not yaitza. He hasn't brought a Pesach Sheni. If it's a kohen who's not chayiv in Pesach Sheni, because he already brought a carbon Pesach, you didn't solve the problem. He can't possibly eat from any of them. Gemara says, okay, let them each take one kohen, let them all together find one kohen and sign him up to each of their karbanos. Only one of them is really a carbon Pesach, So he's only signed up to one Karban Pesach. Let him eat from all of them. Let him eat the chaz of a shilk of each of them. 5 of them he's eating shlamim, and 1 he's eating Karban Pesach. No problem. Moore says, you're right, that would be a good solution. There's a different problem, and there's a different reason we can't do this solution with the shlamim, and that is that we are minimizing the time of eating. Because we're going to have to keep the halachas of Karban Pesach, there's less time for eating. It has to be burned the next morning. There's less time for eating than there is on a Karban Shlamim. So we'll be taking 4 Karbanos Shlamim and minimizing the time that you're allowed to eat it within, and that you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to minimize the time that Karban Shlamim.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.